Hi, I'm Nikolai, aka 56 Miner, and today we'll be unboxing our March Basics box. We'll talk about light, form, and I'll share some tips and tricks that I picked up on my art journey. Let's get into it. Our first item is a custom graphics marker set from Marabou. The set's really interesting as it comes with 3 alcohol-based markers, a blender, and 2 permanent. Let's grab our pad, the Ad Maker marker paper. This bright white marker paper is really unique in its properties and is great for markers because it avoids bleed. Because the paper is a little bit hydrophobic, we can actually blend colors more painterly than we would on traditional paper. Let's use our pad to swatch out our markers. The sketch markers in this set come with 2 nibs. First is going to be a chisel tip, which is great for thick lines, filling in areas. The other nib, a bullet nib, is going to be good for consistent lines that don't have any line weight variance to them. Let's swatch out our colors to get an idea of how they look on the pad. Blenders are a great tool when creating transitions between colors. Here I'll take the brilliant violet and the permanent pink, and by putting a little bit of that blender medium on the pad first, I'll create a smooth transition between the 2 colors. When combining 2 colors of a large value difference, so really dark, really light colors, you'll have to go over a few times to smooth out that transition. Moving on to the permanent markers in this set, these are great tools for outlines and also to build value into the piece. Our first nib is going to be a classic marker nib, and this is going to be great for consistent lines without much variance. And we also have a fine liner, which will be great for detail work and adding a bit of texture if we want. Because these are permanent markers, they're going to be great for outlines or adding flat color, but not necessarily good for transitions. Our next item is the Plume alcohol marker in soft violet. This comes with a flexible brush nib and is great for lettering and making organic marks, and is a great complement to the permanent pink in our marker set. Our final item in this month's box is going to be the Copic Chow in V12, or Pale Lilac. This dual tip marker has a chisel tip as well as a brush tip. The brush tip is going to be great for organic marks and is a little bit stiffer than the Plume, and the color in this marker is going to be just a little bit more on the cool side, which will complement our permanent violet marker. Comparing those markers to the markers in our set, we can definitely see which ones are cool and which ones are warm. By blending colors together that are of the same temperature, we can create smoother transitions that are more pleasing to the eye. That blender marker is really what allows us to push that pigment around and create those transitions. When using high pigment markers like our permanent violet, you can actually use the blender to push some of that pigment out and make details. This technique typically works best with darker colors or really juicy markers. Using the permanent marker in our set, we can create some stems for our flowers. Another technique with illustration markers is to layer in order to build color. Here, I'll lay down some of the little Plume marker to get our base value, and then build up and blend out some of those layers. This is a great way to combine colors and to really expand your marker set. It's good to be conscious of how much pressure you're applying when using illustration markers, as that can affect how much pigment you place on the paper. Here we can use that to our advantage to create some floral shapes where the value is lighter in the center by lifting up when we pull away from the paper. You can also build value by layering and pushing harder to get that darker center. By using the permanent marker to outline our shapes, we can get a more subtle outline that doesn't look as harsh as a typical black. And it's just a great way to add a little bit of dimensionality and depth. Now that we have a good understanding of our materials, let's do a bit of a warm-up. This month I wanted to introduce you to a practice that can really help your marker control. I'll start with 2 lines, and this will be the beginning and end point of a ribbon. This ribbon will allow us to kind of think in 3-dimensional space and get us in the mindset of a good drawing. Try going in with a loose but quick hand to make your marks so that they can come out as smooth as possible, and take your time. This is less about creating the perfect ribbon and more about getting your hand and your eyes to work together. As you get more comfortable, you can try to depict more complex angles and twists and turns. This is also a great tool to use when trying to depict hair, as it allows you to focus more on the sections of the hair instead of the individual strands. We can make these look a little bit more three-dimensional by focusing some shading on the bends in the ribbon. Since our pad is that bright white, it's always going to want to push towards the foreground, and darker areas are going to want to recede into the background. By adding our shading strategically, we can be conscious of this and kind of use it to sell a three-dimensional effect. By incorporating our lip plume marker, we can push this even further. Creating those transitions with the blender marker does take some time, as you will need to go back and forth over it in order to create those smooth transitions. If you're not too worried about creating the softest transitions, you don't have to go over and repeat it. It's really just a matter of taste. By taking the permanent marker and outlining our ribbons, we can create a nice hard outline for our shapes, and it will help to make those transitions look even softer. Outlines are a great way to separate out your subject matter from the back of the pad, but they can make things look a little bit flat. To counteract this, I'm going to add some shading to the starting and end points of our ribbon, and that'll also make that highlight look super sharp. Going back in with that blender just to soften out that color a little bit. Now, color combinations with illustration markers can be a bit tricky. So here you can see that I've swatched out all the markers in our set to give us a good idea of what colors are available to us. Because those purples are so close, we can see a nice color contrast. And by swatching from top to bottom and then left to right, we can see all the colors available to us with the set. Last month we talked a lot about still lifes and the importance of light and form. So this month I wanted to walk through how to build up that color and that value to really give a three-dimensional effect to whatever you're rendering. I'll be using a pomegranate to demonstrate this, but it really applies to anything that you're drawing. Taking a light marker, I'll go in and start my base sketch. This is really just you trying to capture the general shape of the objects, and it's good to start thinking about the light. I know that my light source is going to be to the top right, so it'll have a cast shadow to the bottom left. Next, I'll start filling in areas of shadow, using that blender in order to kind of smooth out those edges. Don't be too concerned with that at these early stages, as those edges typically blend out and become softer as you layer more pigment. Because our paper is such a brilliant white, all we're really doing is darkening up areas to match that shadow. Because we already know our brightest point will be wherever the least amount of marker is. If you have a hard time kind of thinking in terms of value and light and shadow, a good trick is to take a photo of your subject matter, or if you're working from a photo, turn it to black and white. By creating a black and white image, you're just focusing on value and you're kind of filtering out anything that has to do with color. At this point, you can start to really see that three-dimensional effect, and you can see that a lot of those harsh lines that we started with have been blended out either by the blender itself or by layering more color. We can layer the same markers over and over to get the effects that we want, but we're only ever going to get so dark because the paper becomes saturated. So what I'll do next is introduce some of that permanent violet just around the edges in the darkest areas and blend it out with our blender marker. This will help to kind of sell that three-dimensional effect even more. Here we're working in a monochromatic color story, but sometimes you can get colors on your blender marker that you don't want to incorporate. In order to clear it out, you can rub it on a clean sheet of paper, and that should help to lift some of that pigment. At this point, we can really start to see that three-dimensionality that the value work has given us.
At this point, we've been using our purple markers exclusively in order to build up that consistent color in the value. To shift these colors more towards the red, which is going to be true of the real pomegranate color, I'm taking the cadmium red middle in the blender in order to distribute that red pigment throughout the entire piece. This will help kind of lock in that realistic color that we're hoping to achieve. For a little bit more dimensionality and to kind of bring in some color variance, I'll also incorporate the permanent pink. To push the highlights a little bit more, I'll take the blender after rubbing off some of that pigment, and I'll actually lift some of that marker color off the paper, and we can do this because the paper is just slightly hydrophobic. As a final step, I'll go in with our permanent marker in our cocoa brown and use that to isolate the edges and any of the darkest areas. It's really this combination of all the colors that sells that realism. And with that, our piece is done. Hope you enjoyed the video, learned a few things, and if you post your work online, make sure you use #SketchBoxMarch. We love seeing what y'all create each month. And I'll see you next month.